Germany, late spring, 1945. The smoke had thinned, but the silence was thicker than ever. In the shell of a once ordinary village, rooflines had collapsed into stairwells, windows had become charred gaps, and the air still carried the scent of scorched grain and plaster. Most families had fled weeks earlier, those who could. Now, the streets stood hollow, save for the occasional creak of wood settling into ruin, or the whisper of wind through broken stone. A boy, no older than 10, stepped over a fallen beam. His shoes were too large, his father's, perhaps, and they filled with dust as he wandered between what had once been a bakery and the school. He moved without urgency, not searching for anything in particular. His eyes scanned instinctively, the way animals do after the storm has passed, but the threat still lingers. Then, it caught his eye, a flash of metal among the bricks and ash. The sun, low and unbothered, glanced off a smooth surface just beneath a collapsed doorway. The boy crouched, brushed away a thin veil of soot, and pulled it free. 2 tags, stamped steel, worn but intact, linked by a ball chain, cold against his fingers. The language etched into them was foreign, sharp-edged letters, nothing like the soft contours of German script. He turned them over. One tag bore numbers, the other, a name he could not pronounce. American. He stood there for a while, unsure why the object made the air feel heavier. He didn't know what U.S. Army meant. Not exactly. But even a child could sense the weight of possession, the way history sometimes announced itself, not with trumpets, but with an object that shouldn't be here, yet was. The war was said to be over. Radio broadcasts had called it. Allied forces were moving east with confidence. But this village hadn't heard the ending yet, and in his palm was proof that someone, perhaps just hours ago, had still been fighting, or dying, or both. He slipped the chain into his pocket, unaware that he had just become part of a story that began far away and was far from over. In the distance, another engine stirred to life, and on the outskirts of a different village, a soldier had just noticed one dog tag missing from his neck. He had no memory of Germany before the war, no sense of what peace had felt like, or what flags had meant when they weren't sewn to uniforms or painted on crates. For him, the world had always sounded like distant thunder, smelled like iron and ash, and pulsed with quiet warnings only children understood. His Germany was not defined by speeches or maps. It was shaped by empty shelves, whispered fears, and the absence of color in a town where nothing bloomed. By May 1945, the Reich had officially surrendered, but the concept of surrender was abstract to a child who had never known victory. The front had passed through their village like a fever breaking, but the aftermath remained scarred buildings, missing neighbors, and food that arrived late or not at all. Each morning, he woke to routines that masked uncertainty, sweeping dust from rooms without windows, boiling water from wells no longer trusted. The adults spoke in fragments. Names were mentioned in hushed tones, and decisions were made without explanation. The boy watched their faces more than their words, how they paused before answering, how their eyes shifted when the word American was said aloud. He heard stories, but none made sense. Some villagers feared the foreign uniforms. Others said the soldiers brought chocolate and medicine. All the boy knew was that the strangers spoke loudly, moved confidently, and never looked afraid. To him, victory meant silence. No more planes, no more boots marching past his door. But there was no celebration, only a strange, unspoken weight. It lived in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way church bells stayed silent even on Sundays. The only music was the wind, moving through hollowed buildings and forgotten lives. The dog tags never left his pocket. He fingered them absent-mindedly when he was alone, drawn to their shape and coldness. They made him feel something he didn't yet have words for. They were foreign, yes, but also real. Proof that someone had been close, someone who mattered. And though he told no one, he couldn't bring himself to throw them away. In the weeks that followed, he would come to realize that objects outlast men and that, in war, identification is not a courtesy, it is a necessity. For the United States military, dog tags were designed not as decoration, but as documentation, cold, precise, and final. Each set carried 5 elements: name, service number, blood type, religious preference, and branch. No more, no less. A biography reduced to steel, pressed flat, and issued in pairs. They were not worn with pride. They were worn with inevitability. One tag remained with the body. The other, if needed, was removed for records, burial, or notification. In theory, this ensured no man vanished without trace. But theory, phrase in combat. Fire, water, shrapnel, and chaos conspire to erase names just as ruthlessly as they erase faces. The chain that joined them was functional, not sentimental. No engraving of emotion, no gesture toward memory. These tags were not for the soldier, they were for the system. A system built to process loss with efficiency. When a man fell, these slivers of metal became the final witnesses to his presence. They offered no comfort, only certainty. To lose them was more than an administrative error. It was a breach in the contract between the individual and the institution. Without them, death became ambiguous. A soldier might be listed as missing, not dead. A family might receive silence, not closure. And when a pair of tags surfaced unclaimed, it meant something had gone wrong. Someone had died without record, or had been separated from his name in the most literal way possible. The boy, still clutching the foreign chain in his pocket, could not know this. To him, they were curious, out of place. He hadn't been told what dog tags meant. No one had explained their weight, their purpose, or their silence. He only knew they didn't belong to him, that they were once important, that they had not been left behind by accident. Elsewhere, across a table cluttered with reports and ration slips, in May 1945, the broadcasts were clear. The war, they said, was over. Berlin had fallen, treaties were signed, and flags changed hands with the efficiency of clockwork. For generals and politicians, the machinery of conflict paused, divisions stood down, borders were redrawn, and orders began arriving in peacetime language. The official language of victory left little room for ambiguity. Hostilities had ceased. But wars do not end with signatures. Not for those who lived beneath the bombers or who buried the missing without names. For civilians, endings are less decisive. Memory ignores treaties. Grief does not follow timetables. In towns like the one where the boy had found the dog tags, the silence that followed the gunfire did not feel like peace. It felt like aftermath. And aftermath lingers. The boy aged into a young man in a country divided geographically, politically, spiritually. The Germany of his adulthood bore little resemblance to the one he had been born into. New systems replaced old ones. Streets were renamed. Walls went up, but the past remained stubborn. It surfaced in photographs never thrown away, in absences never explained, and in questions no one wanted to answer. The dog tags, once carried in a boy's pocket, were eventually moved to a drawer, then another. They survived 3 relocations, 2 marriages, and the quiet compromises of adult life. At times, he forgot them for years, but when found again during cleaning, during packing, during moments of rare reflection, he never discarded them. He never spoke of them either. Their surface dulled, but the letters remained legible, and something about that permanence troubled him. The world had shifted, he had changed, but the name stamped into steel had not. It stayed frozen, untouched by peace or time. A name without a face, a story without an ending. In the decades that followed, the belief that the war was finished became convenient. It allowed reconstruction, diplomacy, alliances. But it was a belief built on silence, a useful illusion. Because for many, the war had not concluded, it had simply been buried under layers of progress and willful forgetting. He grew old. The dog tags remained, not as proof of guilt or purpose, but as a quiet reminder that history does not vanish when the maps are redrawn. It lingers in drawers, in memories, in the unspoken weight of objects too durable to ignore. And then, one spring morning, his grandson found them. He held them up to the light, just as the boy once had. But this time, someone asked a question. And, far away, in a digitized archive long forgotten by the name pressed into the dog tags was foreign, its syllables sharp, unfamiliar, resistant to the rhythm of the German tongue. The boy had tried once to pronounce it aloud, alone in a stairwell, but it sounded wrong. The consonants scraped together like gravel in his mouth. He said it only once, then never again. To him, English was not a language of possibility. It was the sound of orders barked in the street, of warnings, of signs hastily nailed to half-standing buildings. Later, it would become the language of television and distant power. But in those years just after the surrender, it remained the language of those who won. And for those who lost, some languages carried too much weight to touch. He never asked about the man the tags belonged to. Not his parents, not the neighbors, not the few veterans who returned with hollow eyes and darker memories. To ask would have meant making the loss real. It might have meant being told a story he could not unhear, or worse, learning that no one knew the story at all. In post-war Germany, silence served as protection, and some silences were taught before words. As he grew older, the silence around the tags hardened into habit. German guilt became national, collective, and ceremonial, acknowledged in textbooks, museums, and political speeches. But personal responsibility, the kind that lived inside quiet objects and unspoken questions, was something else. That kind remained locked behind drawer handles and inside the hearts of those who had simply survived. The tags became a kind of unanswered sentence, one that began with a name and ended with nothing. No report, no letter, no face, just metal. Worn, dulled, waiting. They were never treated as relics or tokens. He did not display them on a shelf, nor tuck them into a box of war memorabilia. He did not sell them, though others might have. And he never let them go. They stayed with him not because he claimed them, but because they had claimed him. Sometimes, late at night, he would hold them in his hand and trace the letters with his thumb. Not to remember, but to feel, to acknowledge, without ceremony, that someone else's war had crossed into his life in a way that no document could record. The tags asked no questions, but they never stopped being one. And so they waited through the building of a wall and its collapse, through reunification, through decades of forgetting and remembering in equal measure. The man never spoke the name aloud again, but the silence was not. Across the Atlantic, the war had ended differently. In the United States, there were parades, flags, and headlines declaring victory. But behind drawn curtains, in small towns and crowded cities alike, grief moved quietly. In that final year of fighting, over 400,000 American servicemen had not come home. For their families, the war was not something read about in newspapers. It was something that arrived in envelopes. The telegrams were brief. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret. The words were formal, impersonal, stripped of narrative. No details about where or how, just that a son, a husband, a brother was gone. In some cases, the message was even more ambiguous. Missing in action, no body, no grave, just absence. When a body was found and properly identified, it could be shipped home, encased in a regulation casket, accompanied by a military escort. But not all bodies were found, and not all were intact. On battlefields across Europe and the Pacific, the war had erased names as efficiently as it had ended lives. Dog tags, when intact, were the safeguard against this anonymity. They were meant to anchor memory in metal to guarantee that each man would be known, even in death. But when dog tags were lost, or separated, or never recovered, something fragile broke. Not just in the system, but in the minds of those left behind. Memory scattered. Hope lingered longer than it should have. Families clung to the word missing as if it contained a door not yet closed. Photos remained on mantels for years. Chairs were not moved. Drawers were left untouched. Somewhere in America, perhaps in Ohio, or Kansas, or the Bronx, a family received one of those telegrams, and nothing more. They held onto uniforms, letters, snapshots. They told stories with careful repetition, always ending with a pause. The kind of pause that asks a question no one answers, because without a body, there is no closure. And without closure, grief becomes sediment-layered, quiet, unresolved. War's bureaucracy accounted for weapons, fuel, supplies. It processed promotions, casualties, and strategic gains. But it was never built to hold the emotional weight of uncertainty. It could name the dead, but it could not explain them. And when names disappeared, or were misplaced, or quietly folded into the missing, the machine simply moved on. The dog tags found in that ruined German village decades ago were never supposed to be lost. They were when the last Allied boots left German soil, they did not leave behind peace. They left a fracture. In the ruins of Europe, a new kind of war took shape, one without trenches or front lines, yet no less defined by tension. By the late 1940s, the continent had frozen into ideological halves. To the west, democracy, commerce, American influence. To the east, command economies, surveillance, Soviet presence. Germany itself was split down the center, not with a sword but with policy. The boy came of age in this new geography. His world was not built on ruins anymore, but on division. Barbed wire borders, state radio, passports checked twice. His life unfolded under the quiet supervision of governments more concerned with loyalty than liberty. And yet, like millions of others, he adapted. He learned when to speak and when not to. He worked. He married. He raised a family beneath flags that changed more than once. The dog tags moved with him, not proudly, not publicly, but always deliberately. From the first apartment with rationed heat to the flat he would retire in, they came along. They survived relocation notices, regime changes, power outages, and quiet fear. They crossed checkpoints, tucked inside a coat pocket. No one ever searched them closely. Perhaps no one cared, or perhaps no one recognized what they were. As he aged, their meaning changed. At first, they were just a mystery, then a burden. But slowly, imperceptibly, they became something else. A witness. They had survived just as he had. And in their silence, they began to speak. He understood, finally, that they were not simply lost property. They were testimony. To a man, to a moment, to a story that history had not bothered to close. And yet, for all his reflection, reaching across the ocean felt impossible. The Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical stalemate. It was a wall of silence, one made not of bricks, but of systems and fears and distance. Even if he had known where to send the tags or what to write, what would he have said? That he had kept them all these years? That he had done nothing but wonder? He watched the world change again, saw the wall come down in 1989, saw borders soften, currencies shift, maps redrawn. But still, the tags remained in their drawer, now less a secret and more a relic. He would sometimes hold them in the early morning, when the house was quiet, and stare at the name. The years had dulled the steel, but not the truth. Someone had died and been forgotten, and for reasons he could never quite explain, he had kept that memory alive. He never spoke to his children about them. Perhaps he feared their reaction. Perhaps he believed, deep down, that the story was no longer his to finish. Or perhaps silence had become habit one that comforted more than it condemned. The Cold War time moved, not with the noise of war, but with the silence of change. The Cold War ended, borders softened, and Europe no longer bristled with the same visible tension. But the more profound shift came not with walls falling, but with signals rising from dial tones, satellites, and screens. By the early 2000s, the world had become searchable. What once required permissions, postage, and persistence now required only curiosity and a keyboard. Names long buried in paper files were scanned, tagged, uploaded. National archives in Washington and Virginia digitized the chaos of war enlistment forms, after-action reports, casualty lists, even images of dog tags issued to the fallen. In the age of analog, loss was final. In the age of the internet, loss could be traced. The younger generation knew this instinctively. They typed names into search bars, translated documents in real time, navigated databases built by historians and volunteers. English was no longer distant. It was now just another language on a drop-down menu. The grandson, born decades after the last American troop left Germany, understood this intuitively. His world had no checkpoints. His memory of the war was shaped not by silence, but by documentaries, forums, and pixels. The old man noticed this shift, not in theory, but in questions. One afternoon, his grandson asked him where the dog tags had come from, and this time, he did not deflect. He brought them out, slow and quiet, and laid them on the table like an inheritance he hadn't meant to give. The boy studied the tags not as relics, but as information. He read the name aloud. He copied the serial number. He noticed the blood type. Where his grandfather had once seen only a mystery, he now saw a starting point. Each marking was no longer abstract. It was data, searchable, verifiable, trackable. The old man watched as the boy typed, and something in him stirred not guilt, not pride, but permission. For the first time in his life, the object in his hand didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a bridge. He leaned in and began to study the markings again, not with detachment, but with intent. They worked side by side for days. Archives from the National World War II Museum, records from the Defense POW, MIA Accounting Agency, even declassified field reports from 1945. The American name, once foreign and unspoken, now began to reassemble. It belonged to a man, a soldier, a unit, a final known location. The pieces didn't yet form a conclusion, but they formed a direction. For the old man, this was the shift. History was no longer something that had happened to him. It was something he could now touch, question, and possibly correct. The symbols he had once feared, the numbers, the foreign letters, were no longer beyond reach. They were leads. And though decades had passed and many of the official witnesses had died, something in the record still lived. The world had changed. The barrier between citizen and archive had thinned. Memory, once trapped in drawers and guarded by distance, had become portable. And with each new search result, each document retrieved, the gap between past and present narrowed. The tags were no longer silent. He had held the name in silence for decades. But now, for the first time, he spoke it in an email. The man once, the boy who found the dog tags in the rubble, typed cautiously, unsure what would follow. He reached out to veterans organizations, archivists, even embassy contacts. His message was simple, almost clinical. I believe I have the identification tags of an American soldier missing in action during the Second World War. He included photos, serial numbers, and the town where they had been discovered. He did not include the story, not yet. He wasn't sure anyone would believe it. The first replies came slowly. Weeks passed, then months. Bureaucracies, even in peace, still move at the pace of paperwork. But when the responses arrived, they were precise. And behind their formality was something else. Interest. The serial number matched a known enlistment. The blood type, the branch, the year, all consistent. The man on the tag had existed, had served, had vanished. His name, Private First Class Robert L. Winstead, Infantry, 42nd Division. Last seen April 1945, advancing through a contested sector near the Bavarian border. Declared missing in action. Presumed dead. The file, long dormant, reopened. Suddenly, the tags were no longer relics. They were evidence. The chain of numbers and letters, once inert, had activated a sequence of attention from Pentagon archivists, from military historians, from agencies tasked with accounting for the unaccounted. A record had stirred. A ghost had been named. With that name came a service record. Height, weight, next of kin. His mother had received the telegram in 1945. She had never received the tags. His body had never been recovered. His grave had never been dug. Now, after 70 years, his file was active again. The man read through every detail. Where once he had avoided the weight of the object, now he carried it deliberately. The search had moved from curiosity to something heavier, responsibility. He had not known the soldier, had not seen him fall, but for reasons he could not fully name, he had been given a fragment of his story, and now, at last, the chance to return it. He sat with the document spread out before him. The official tone did little to blunt the reality. A young man had vanished. The war had moved on, but in this drawer, in this home, one part of him had remained. He printed the forms, signed declarations, notarized statements of possession and intent. The tags were not his to keep. They never had been. They were meant to go back to the archives, to the record, and perhaps, if family could be found, to someone still waiting for closure. There was no drama in the act, no headlines, just the sound of paper being folded, of a package sealed carefully. A small box, addressed to a government office in Virginia, containing a name that had been missing for most of a century. As he walked to the post office, he realized something strange. For the first time in his life, the war felt near. Not as noise, not as history, but as responsibility. He had not caused it, but he had been part of it, if only by witnessing something others had missed. And now, someone else would open that box. They would read that name. They would feel that weight. By the time the package crossed the Atlantic, she had already learned how to live without him. The war had taken her husband when she was barely 22. Their marriage had lasted 2 years. Their final photograph together was taken just before his deployment, her in a pressed floral dress, him in uniform, squinting against the sun. It would sit in a frame for the next 70 years, untouched, beside a folded flag and a pair of leather gloves he had mailed home the winter before he vanished. When the letters stopped, she waited. At first, with worry. Then, with dread. Finally, with a numb sort of acceptance, the telegram came 2 months later. Missing in action. No remains recovered. No date of death confirmed. Just a line between presence and absence that no one could close. She was told to hope. So she did. Quietly, in private. But the seasons passed, and the war ended, and no man stepped off the train. Friends urged her to move forward. She did, in the outward ways that society rewards. She worked, she remarried, she raised children. But memory is not always loud. It lives in habits. In the way she never gave away his books. In the way she still turned her head when she heard his name. His dog tags were never returned. She noticed this. She asked once, early on, but was told the records were incomplete. Her husband's file would remain open but dormant. Like so many thousands others from that final chaotic push through Germany. She was not alone in this uncertainty. The war had scattered many endings. But even so, the absence of those small metal tags left something unfinished. With time, grief became private architecture. It shaped her quietly. Not with tears, but with rituals, coffee at the same window. Old letters kept in a box too heavy for its size. Her second husband never asked about the first. He didn't need to. Some silences were too clear to challenge. She never expected anything more. Not after decades. Not after birthdays missed, anniversaries passed, names faded from government files. She assumed whatever could be known had been known. Whatever could be returned had been returned. The rest, she believed, belonged to time. But then the call came. A quiet voice, measured and respectful. "Mrs. Winstead, we've received new information concerning your late husband's identification tags. May we send you something?" At first, she thought it was a mistake, or a scam. But then the letter arrived. Official, simple, a name she hadn't seen in years, printed clearly in the subject line. A photograph of the tags. A summary of their journey. How they had been found. How they had traveled. How, at last, they had come home. She held the tags in her hands 3 days later. They were cold, heavier than she expected. The chain had rusted slightly, but the letters were clear. Robert L. Winstead. Her fingers stopped on the blood type, the service number, the silent details he had once worn against his chest. There was no ceremony, no music, just a kitchen table, a late afternoon sun, and the hum of the refrigerator in the background. She did not cry. Not then. But she sat for a long time with the tags in her hand and finally said the words she had been holding for 70 years. "You're home." It didn't change the past. It didn't rewrite history. But something closed. Not loudly, not completely, but enough. Enough to feel that he had not been lost. The letter was handwritten, carefully folded, and sent across an ocean that had once separated enemies. It carried no official seal, no government watermark, no typed report, just ink on paper, foreign script, but deliberate, every line considered, every word chosen. It arrived in early autumn. The trees were just beginning to turn outside her home in Indiana. She retrieved it from the mailbox with the day's circulars and set it aside at first, mistaking it for something ordinary. But later that evening, after the dishes were done and the house had quieted, she noticed the return address, Germany. The handwriting was unfamiliar, not rushed, not decorative, just sincere. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet, cream-colored, folded once down the center. The salutation read simply, "Dear Mrs. Winstead." The letter explained what had happened, not with dramatic language, but with gentle facts. A man, once a boy during the war, had found something, had kept it, had carried it, quietly, for decades. And now, after years of uncertainty, he believed it had belonged to her husband. The tags had already been sent back through official channels, he explained. But the letter was something else. A gesture, an attempt to speak, not just return. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't explain why he had kept them for so long. He only said this, I never knew what they meant until I did, and once I understood, I could not keep them anymore. She read the letter twice, then a third time. The words struck something untouched in years, not just grief, but recognition. For so long, the story had belonged only to her. Now, suddenly, it had chapters written in another language, in another country, by someone who had lived a different war on the same day. She remembered the moment she received the tags, the feel of them in her hand, the impossible confirmation that they had survived when he had not. But now, reading the letter, she felt something shift again. Not closure exactly, but clarity. That grief, like memory, could travel across borders, through time, and into the hands of strangers who didn't owe you anything but chose to care. The letter did not ask her to respond, but she did. A short note typed on her old Smith Corona, thanking him not for finding the tags, but for carrying them when she could not. She mailed it the next day. 2 weeks later, she received another envelope this time, with a photo. It was the man, now in his 80s, standing beside his grandson. Between them, on a cloth-covered table, lay the tags. The caption on the back was written in English, translated carefully, "Before we sent them home." And then came the final line of the letter, a question. "If you are willing, we would like to meet." She hesitated. It had been so long since the war. So much life had passed in its shadow. But something inside her, shaped by the silence of years, nudged her forward. There were questions she'd never asked, because there had never been anyone to answer them. But maybe now, at the edge of the century, there was someone who had witnessed a different side of the loss. She wrote back. Her reply was brief. Yes, they met in spring. The flight had been long, the arrangements delicate. But when she stepped off the train in the small Bavarian town, the air was crisp, and the world seemed momentarily still. She wore a dark coat, pressed carefully the night before. He waited at the edge of the platform, hat in hand, unsure whether to wave. Neither had rehearsed what to say. It had been 80 years since the war had passed through this place. Buildings had been restored, streets renamed. But beneath the surface, something remained, something that could not be paved over. When their eyes met, it was not with recognition, but with a quiet understanding that they had carried the same name, in different ways, for longer than either had expected. They didn't rush the greeting. There was no ceremony, no awkward pleasantries, just two elderly strangers, once separated by war, now standing face to face in peace. She extended her hand. He took it gently, his grip unsure, as if measuring whether the gesture was enough. It was. In the sitting room of his modest home, the tags rested on a cloth-covered table. He had taken them out an hour before she arrived, arranging them not as artifacts, but as something more delicate, somewhere between memory and offering. They sat across from each other, the tags between them. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of a small wall clock and the occasional wind pressing against the window. No translators were needed. Silence, after all, has always been fluent. She reached forward, fingers trembling, and picked up the chain. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she nodded not to him, but to the weight in her palm. "They're lighter than I expected," she said. He smiled faintly, then replied in careful English. "They were heavier in 1945. There were no apologies. None were asked for. None were owed. He had not taken her husband. She had not chosen the war. Their countries had collided before they could understand why. But here, in this small room, acknowledgement hung in the air like sunlight, through sheer curtains, soft, unspoken. Enough. He told her what little he had remembered. The day he found them, the years they spent in drawers, the moment he realized they were no longer his to carry. She told him about Robert, about his letters, his laughter, the last words he wrote before vanishing into Europe. For a brief moment, the soldier was no longer missing. He was present, in their words, in their pauses, in the line between them that the war had once cut open and time had taken decades to close. They did not speak long. Age had made them both tired quickly. But before she left, he stood and offered her the photograph his grandson had taken months earlier of the tags, before they were sent home. She placed it in her handbag without looking. She would keep it, she said, to remember not the war, but the stranger who had chosen not to forget. As they parted at the door, she turned once more to look at the house. He waved from the doorway, not the wave of farewell, but of recognition. They had never been enemies, just people caught in history. And when the door closed, something subtle happened. Not loudly, not with flags or speeches, but quietly, history exhaled. What arrived in the widow's hands was not just metal. It was memory weighted, weathered, and waiting. The dog tags had crossed oceans and decades to reach her. But they did not come alone. Inside the carefully packed envelope was a letter from the Department of Defense, formal but precise. It included the soldier's full record, what had been reconstructed, line by line, from digitized reports and faded field notes. There was a date, a unit, a last known location, no longer just a number on a chain. Robert L. Winstead was, at last, a man again. She sat at her kitchen table as she read it, the tags beside her, resting on a folded cloth. Her hands trembled as they followed the words. The confirmation brought a silence she had not felt in years. Not the absence of sound, but the quiet that comes when something long held in uncertainty is finally named. Her husband had fallen in southern Germany during a final sweep of resistance near a rail junction. The records placed him with his unit until the evening of the 28th of April, 1945. After that, only silence. Until now. The paper offered no drama, no final quote, no eyewitness. Just a series of facts enough to construct a shape where only shadow had lived. It was more than she had expected, but not too much. Just enough to hold. For decades, her grief had worn the shape of assumption. She had assumed he was dead, assumed it had been quick, assumed no one would ever know more. But now, the burden of assumption had shifted. Not to clarity, exactly, but to something closer. He had been lost, not forgotten. The tags were a kind of proof, not of heroism or legacy, but of fact. They had touched the same soil he had. They had rested where he had fallen. They had waited, as she had, for someone to carry them forward. And now, here they were, thin steel circles bearing more meaning than any monument. But they were not the only return. The man who had carried them for so long, who had found them as a boy and kept them as a man, did not ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to explain the decades of silence. He only sent what he could and came when asked, not out of guilt, but out of obligation. The kind of responsibility that chooses you without permission or reward. When he had first written, he had expected nothing in return, just that the tags find their way home. But now, standing across from the widow in her home, he offered her something else, clarity, not just in paper, but in presence. She did not ask why he had kept them. She didn't need to. His expression said enough. He hadn't known what to do with them, only that they were not his to discard. So he had waited through checkpoints, through marriages, through the Cold War and its uneasy peace. He had waited because history had not finished its sentence. And when it finally had, he had written the last line in ink, not silence. They spoke briefly. About her husband, about the war, about the years that followed, and the decades that went unanswered. There was no blame, only quiet recognition that some burdens pass through generations, not because they are ours, but because someone must carry them until the right hands are ready. And in that small meeting, something shifted. The debris of war, so often reduced to rubble, to loss, became something else. Reconciliation, not the political kind, not the kind brokered by diplomats or signed into treaties, but the kind that happens when one life touches another across time, and neither looks away. There would be no press release, no ceremony, just a photograph taken by her grandson of the tags resting on her palms, the chain folded gently between her fingers. The caption she asked him to write on the back was simple: returned, not lost. For days afterward, the house was quiet, not in sorrow but in stillness. She had spent decades imagining her husband's end. Now, she didn't have to. The picture had changed. Not erased, just focused. She could see the field where he fell, the last ridge he climbed, the village beyond, half burned, where a boy had stumbled into memory without knowing. And when she thought of that boy now, an old man who had crossed oceans to return something that had never belonged to him, she did not feel resentment. She felt gratitude. He had not rewritten the past, but he had repaired it. Because some losses are permanent, but not all absences have to be. In the end, what was returned was not just metal or records or the shape of a name. It was permission to remember differently, to grieve not what was missing, but what had endured. This is not a story of absolution. It does not wash the blood from history or return the dead to the living. It does not offer tidy resolution or moral symmetry. The war left wounds that cannot be undone by kindness, And those who lived through it carry scars that no apology, however sincere, can reach. No meeting, no returned object, no closing of a file can erase the truth of what happened between 1939 and 1945. Millions perished. Cities were leveled. Entire populations were displaced, destroyed, or disfigured by the machinery of ideology and empire. The tags in this story are not a symbol of peace. They are a fragment of violence, stamped in steel. They are not healed. They are carried. This is not a story that equalizes grief. The German boy who found the tags did not suffer as the man who wore them did. The widow's loss was not mirrored by the quiet discomfort of the one who kept her husband's name hidden in a drawer. There is no balance here. The story does not try to invent one, nor does it soften what the war was. It does not romanticize the aftermath or wrap the silence in poetic comfort. War was hunger. War was fire. War was fear that shaped children before they knew language. The fact that one name survived does not redeem the countless that vanished without echo. Memory, however precise, cannot replace the lives that never finished their sentences. What this story refuses deliberately, and with restraint, is sentimentality. It does not mistake resolution for redemption or return for resurrection. There are no soaring scores, no dramatic reunions, no revelation that undoes the past. It resists the urge to say that something was meant to be, or that history corrects itself when watched long enough. It does not. But if this is not a story of cleansing, it is still a story of meaning. Because what it shows quietly, insistently, is that time, too, is a moral force. Not because it forgives, but because it reveals. It exposes what was hidden. It reopens questions that were once too dangerous to ask, and in rare moments, it delivers a second chance not to relive, but to do right by what was left undone. This story does not offer innocence, but it does offer choice. A choice made by a man who could have forgotten and chose instead to remember. A choice by a widow who could have refused contact, but opened her door instead. A choice to see war not just as something that happens, but as something that echoes and can, in pieces, be answered. It shows that dignity does not need spectacle. That repair can happen without audience. That history, when held carefully, does not always crush. Sometimes it asks to be carried forward, not rewritten, but handled with care. That is what this story does. It handles something too long abandoned and passes it gently to hands that still know how to feel its weight. The boy who found the tags did not become a hero. He became a witness. He did not fight, but he lived among the ruins of those who had. And when the world changed, when the tools to search and the language to speak finally reached him, he made a choice that history rarely grants. He responded, not loudly, but honestly. The tags were returned. The name re-entered the record. A widow, older now than her husband ever was, received something she had long since stopped expecting. Not closure, but context. And in a world often too quick to forget, that was enough. So no, this is not a story that resolves war, but it does remember it precisely, painfully, with the kind of care that does not decorate pain, but honors it. It remembers a soldier whose name outlasted his body. It remembers a boy who kept a secret longer than he understood it. It remembers a silence that lasted generations, and the people who finally broke it, not with anger, but with patience. This story, they rest now in a glass box, but not behind museum glass, not on a pedestal, not beneath fluorescent lights in a building that catalogs war like an inventory. No, they sit inside a home on a shelf near the window, where the light changes gently through the day. A simple case, clear, unadorned, 2 steel tags linked by a chain, silent, cleaned, but not polished, their edges still faintly dulled by the passage of time. They are where they belong. They are not there to be admired. They are not trophies or evidence. They are not symbols of valor, though the man who wore them showed it. They are not historical artifacts, though they carry history in every millimeter. They are memory held in metal, carried across continents, returned not to a nation, but to the people who never stopped feeling the absence they represented. A boy had found them, decades earlier, beneath brick and ash. He had no language for what he held, only a sense that it mattered, that, whatever it was, it should not be discarded. Years passed. Regimes changed. Borders moved. And still, he kept them. They passed from drawer to drawer, aging with him not as a secret, but as a question waiting for its moment. Eventually, the boy became a man, and the question became an obligation. What had begun as a child's accidental discovery had become something heavier, something moral. He was not the soldier's friend, nor his enemy. He owed him nothing. But history sometimes gives us pieces it never meant to lose. And what we choose to do with them reveals more than we often realize. He could have kept the tags until death, another relic among many. He could have forgotten them, or sold them, or buried them again. But instead, he carried them forward. He turned memory into motion, silence into speech, and loss into restoration, not of life, but of name. For the widow, their return did not offer relief. It offered shape. Her grief was not resolved, but redefined. For 70 years, her husband had been a story without a final line. Now, the sentence could end not in punctuation, but in presence. The tags brought no closure, but they brought something better: certainty. And the kind of peace that comes not with forgetting, but with knowing exactly where something has been and why it matters still. She does not speak of the war often, but she does speak of the tags. She tells her grandson the story now and then, how they came back, how they crossed oceans and decades and strangers, how they sat between her and a man she'd never met, and yet who had unknowingly carried her pain with him across most of his life. She does not frame the story in terms of fate, nor does she decorate it with sentiment. She tells it plainly, because what happened was not a miracle. It was a decision made by one person, held over time, and acted on when it mattered. That, she believes, is what made it sacred. The tags complete something, not the war, not the marriage, not the man, but a circle of memory. From soldier to battlefield, to child, to man, to widow, to grandson. Nothing was undone, but something, finally, was finished. For 6 decades, the chain had carried the past like a question. Now, it lay still not as a weight, but as an answer. They had been stamped for death, designed for certainty in the face of chaos, issued by a military that understood how quickly men could vanish. Their purpose was to outlast the soldier, and they had, but their true purpose had taken longer to return, not just to the nation that issued them, but to the people who still remembered the man who wore them. And in their return, they became something else. Not evidence, not memorabilia, but proof that memory, when handled with care, can outlive war. This is not the kind of ending that history writes often. More names remain missing than are ever recovered. More records remain cold than are ever reopened. But this story, quiet, ordinary, precise, is the exception that shows us what is possible when the past is not left alone. The weight of 2 small tags, once worn beneath a soldier's uniform, has now been shared by strangers. They remind us that even in the chaos of global conflict, even in the aftermath of destruction, something can still be carried home.